First class isn't for people like you. Maybe you should try economy where you belong. Those cutting words from the Apex Airlines staffer landed like a slap in the middle of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, leaving 17-year-old identical twins Amara and Kayla Harris frozen in shock, their first solo college tour hanging by a thread. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe everyone deserves equal respect, like and subscribe to help share this story. Now, let's begin. It was a bustling November morning at O'Hare, one of the busiest airports in the country, where travelers hurried in every direction and announcements echoed above the crowd. Amara and Kayla stood side by side at the Apex Airlines check-in counter, their boarding passes clutched tightly, hearts racing with anticipation for what was supposed to be one of the most exciting days of their lives. Their father, Derek Harris, had surprised them with first-class tickets to Seattle, a gift for their hard work at Lincoln Academy, where both were honor students on track for scholarships. It wasn't just a trip, it was the beginning of a dream. Amara, the calmer and more strategic twin, stood slightly behind Kayla, adjusting the strap of her black backpack, her fingers tracing the edge of the boarding pass like she was coding through a solution in her head. Kayla, bold and outspoken, kept tapping her phone nervously, glancing around at the other passengers, both dressed simply in gray hoodies, jeans, and sneakers, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But as they would soon learn, appearances meant everything to the man behind the counter. Ethan Marshall, a check-in agent in his early 30s, had a polished uniform, slicked back hair, and a smile that seemed warm, at least until it wasn't. He finished helping a white couple ahead of them, joking about Seattle weather and offering them tips on the best restaurants near Pike Place Market. But when Amara stepped forward and slid the 2 first-class boarding passes across the counter, Ethan's expression shifted. The warmth evaporated, replaced with a blank stare as he glanced at their tickets, then at their faces, without acknowledging them. He suddenly turned his head and waved to the family standing behind them. "Next!" he called cheerfully to a white couple still fumbling with their luggage tags. Kayla's head snapped up, disbelief flashing in her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "We were next." Ethan finally looked at them, his gaze sweeping from their sneakers up to their braided hair, a slow, deliberate once-over that carried judgment heavier than words. "You'll wait your turn," he said flatly, his tone clipped and dismissive. Kayla's shoulders stiffened, but Amara placed a calming hand on her sister's arm and stepped forward with quiet dignity. "Here are our passes," she said softly, setting them on the counter. Ethan picked them up, turning them over in his hands as if searching for flaws, then let out a low chuckle under his breath. "First class?" he said, letting the disbelief drip from every syllable. "Are you sure you're in the right place? First-class check-in is usually over there." His finger pointed toward another counter across the hall where business travelers in expensive suits lined up, sipping lattes and checking stock prices on their phones. Kayla narrowed her eyes and leaned slightly forward, her voice firm. "These are our tickets," she said clearly. "Our father booked them for us." Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his elbows casually on the counter, his lips curling into a condescending half-smile. "Sure," he said slowly, drawing out the word. "Then I'm going to need to verify these, without waiting for permission." He disappeared into a back office, their passes clutched in his hand. The minutes stretched painfully as passengers behind them began murmuring, impatient but curious. A few glances burned into the twins' backs, some pitying, others indifferent. Kayla tapped her foot, arms crossed tightly, muttering under her breath, "This is ridiculous." Amara stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, her voice low and even. "Let him do his job. We'll handle it later. 15 minutes later." Ethan emerged, His polished smile returned, but colder now, rehearsed. He slid 2 new boarding passes across the counter without meeting their eyes. System error. He said loudly enough for those nearby to hear. Your first-class seats have been reassigned. You're now in economy, gate C17. Kayla blinked in disbelief, her voice rising despite herself. What? No. We paid for first class. But Ethan cut her off with a sharp whisper, leaning just close enough for them to hear. First class isn't for everyone, he murmured, his tone dripping venom. Some people just don't belong there. The meaning was undeniable, the insult deliberate. Heat rushed to Kayla's face as her hands clenched into fists, ready to respond. But Amara touched her arm firmly, her quiet strength holding her sister back. Not here, Amara said softly. Not yet. Kayla's breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling rapidly, every muscle in her body demanding she fight back. But she swallowed the anger, her pride stinging like a fresh wound, behind them. Murmurs grew louder as curious passengers leaned closer, sensing tension but pretending not to stare. Amara took the economy passes reluctantly, turning without another word, her composure masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. As they walked away from the counter, Kayla's voice was low, almost trembling. I want to call Dad. Right now. Amara shook her head gently, keeping her voice even despite the lump in her throat. He's in a board meeting. We can handle this ourselves. But neither sister noticed Ethan picking up the phone behind them, his voice lowered, the edge of a smirk tugging at his lips. Heads up. He muttered to someone on the other end. 2 passengers headed your way. Might cause trouble. It was the first move in a series of quiet, calculated strikes they couldn't yet see coming, the beginning of a chain of humiliations carefully laid out ahead of them. The line at the TSA security checkpoint stretched like an endless maze, but Amara and Kayla Harris barely noticed the crowd. They were still burning from Ethan Marshall's cutting words at the Apex Airlines counter, the humiliation sitting heavy in their chests. Yet they clung to the hope that the worst was behind them. That hope shattered the moment they stepped forward and saw Monica Reed, the TSA agent assigned to their lane, a woman in her late 30s with a crisp uniform, perfectly polished boots, and an expression that managed to be both bored and sharp at the same time. A white couple just ahead of them breezed through without so much as a glance. Their bags waved past the scanner, their smiles untouched. But when Monica's eyes landed on the twins, something cold shifted in her face. She glanced down at their boarding passes, her jaw tightening slightly. And then she stepped forward, blocking the conveyor belt with one hand. Random screening, she said curtly, her voice cutting through the hum of the crowd like a blade. Kayla blinked in disbelief. Excuse me? She asked, her tone polite but edged with confusion. Monica didn't repeat herself. Instead, she motioned to a secondary lane roped off from the rest of the passengers. Step over here, she ordered flatly. Amara hesitated, trying to keep her voice steady. Is there a problem? Monica arched a single brow, her hand brushing the radio on her shoulder. Do you want to make this harder than it needs to be? The threat was subtle but clear. Passengers behind them began to shift impatiently, a few craning their necks to watch, reluctantly. The twins moved into the separate lane, hearts pounding. There. Monica barked instructions without explanation, snapping on a pair of latex gloves as she ordered them to remove their shoes, belts, and hoodies, placing everything into trays. Amara set her laptop on the belt carefully, but Monica grabbed it suddenly, flipping it open with one hand and running a swab aggressively across the keyboard. Careful. That's my school project, Amara said quickly, trying to sound calm. But Monica didn't acknowledge her. Instead, she shook a small pill bottle she had pulled from Amara's bag, rattling it loudly. What's this? She demanded. Amara blinked. Allergy medication, she said softly. There's a prescription label right there. Monica squinted at the label, then tossed the bottle back into the bin carelessly. Kayla stepped forward, her frustration building. Why are you treating us like this? She asked sharply, her voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. Monica's expression didn't change. She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice so only they could hear. Because people like you always try to get away with something, she murmured coldly, the words stinging like an open wound. Amara felt her throat tighten, her vision blurring for just a second, but she forced herself to stay composed, clinging to her usual strategy of quiet strength. Kayla, however, clenched her fists, her fiery temper threatening to explode, but Amara touched her arm quickly, shaking her head slightly, silently pleading for her sister to hold on. The search escalated, growing more invasive with every passing minute. Monica ordered a full-body pat-down, her gloved hands moving roughly along their arms, torsos, and legs in front of dozens of watching strangers. Kayla's jaw clenched so hard it hurt, tears of frustration stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "This is humiliating," she whispered through clenched teeth, her voice breaking slightly. Monica ignored her, stepping back with a satisfied nod. "Clear," she said loudly, as if she had done them a favor, but before they could gather their belongings. Another officer approached, a tall man with a shaved head and a stern expression, his badge reading Carl Jenkins. "Phones," he said abruptly, holding out his hand. Amara hesitated. "Why?" she asked cautiously. "Random device inspection," Carl said, his voice flat. "Unlock them." Kayla's patience snapped. "No," she said sharply, stepping back protectively. "We've already been searched, our bags cleared, and now you want our phones too? This is ridiculous." Carl's face hardened. "Ma'am, you're obstructing security procedures," he said loudly enough for the nearby passengers to hear, drawing more unwanted attention, before Kayla could respond. Amara stepped forward quickly, forcing calm into her voice despite the storm raging inside her. "We'll comply," she said softly, unlocking her phone and handing it over, hoping to avoid further escalation. Carl scrolled briefly, then handed it back. But the damage was already done. A few passengers nearby were whispering, their glances sharp and cutting, in the corner of her eye. Amara noticed a young Asian woman lifting her phone discreetly, recording the interaction. Their gaze met for a split second, and the woman gave the faintest nod of solidarity before lowering her phone quickly when Carl turned toward her. "Delete that," he barked, stepping toward her. She hesitated but complied reluctantly, fear flickering in her eyes. Monica, satisfied with the scene she had orchestrated, waved them forward at last. "You're free to go," she said curtly, already turning to the next passenger. But free was the last thing the twins felt as they gathered their scattered belongings, their hands shaking as they slipped back into their hoodies and laced up their sneakers in silence. Kayla's voice trembled when she finally spoke, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "This isn't random. Amara," she said bitterly, her voice low so only her sister could hear. "You know that, right?" Amara nodded silently, her face pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. She knew it. They both knew it. And yet, she whispered, "We'll handle it at the gate." Kayla looked at her sister, her eyes red but blazing with fire. "No," she whispered fiercely. "I'm calling Dad. I don't care if he's in a meeting." But Amara shook her head firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Not yet," she said softly. "Not until we have to." As they walked away, Kayla glanced back over her shoulder, catching Monica watching them still, arms folded, lips curved in the faintest smirk, like she knew this was far from over. Neither sister noticed Monica leaning toward her radio, murmuring softly to someone on the other end. "Heads up," she said quietly, her tone sharp and calculated. "Two flagged passengers. Approaching gate C-17. Expect trouble." The warning set another trap in motion, one the twins couldn't see yet, tightening around them like an invisible net. They thought the worst was behind them, but in reality, the day had only just begun. Amara and Kayla Harris walked slowly through the terminal, their steps heavy, the sting from the TSA ordeal still burning in their chests, hoping a warm meal would calm their nerves before the long flight ahead. But when they spotted the sleek glass doors of Skyway Bistro, a well-known restaurant near Gate C-17, neither of them expected the next wave of humiliation waiting inside. The bistro's modern design, marble floors, and soft lighting made it look welcoming, and inside they could clearly see at least 6 empty tables scattered among the dining area. Kayla pulled Amara gently by the arm. "Come on," she said quietly, forcing a small smile. "Let's at least eat something before the flight." As they stepped up to the hostess stand, a young white woman named Lauren Brooks glanced up from her tablet, her perfectly curled blonde hair framing a face that went from polite professionalism to cold dismissal the moment her eyes landed on the twins. "Hi. Table for 2, Amara said softly, offering a friendly smile. Lauren's gaze shifted briefly to their hoodies and simple jeans, then back to the seating chart on her screen, her expression tightening slightly. "We're fully booked right now," she said flatly, her voice clipped and impersonal. Kayla frowned, glancing past her shoulder at the wide-open dining area where multiple tables were empty. "Booked?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "But there are at least 6 open tables right there." Lauren's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Those are reserved," she replied curtly, tapping something quickly on her tablet. Amara leaned forward slightly, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I just checked online before we came in," she said softly. "Skyway Bistro doesn't take reservations. It's walk-in only." Lauren's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't budge, her voice growing cooler. "The policy changed recently," she said briskly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You'll have to wait about 45 minutes, before Amara could respond. A white family of 4 walked in behind them, the parents laughing as they shook off the chill from outside. "Hi there," the father said brightly. "Do you have room for us?" Lauren's face transformed instantly, her expression softening into warmth as she smiled widely. "Absolutely," she said sweetly. "Right this way." She grabbed 4 menus and led them past the twins to a table in the middle of the dining area, the very same table she had claimed was reserved seconds earlier. Kayla's lips parted slightly, her breath hitching as her chest tightened. "Did that just happen?" she whispered to Amara, her voice trembling between anger and shock. Amara nodded slowly, her jaw tightening, forcing herself to breathe evenly as she whispered back. "Keep calm. Don't give her what she wants." But Kayla's restraint was fraying fast. "This is unbelievable," she said louder now, turning back to Lauren as she returned to the podium. "Why did you just seat them? You told us you were fully booked." Lauren's fake smile returned, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Sir." "Ma'am," she said smoothly, ignoring Kayla's direct question. "If you'd like to leave your name, I can put you on the waiting list." At that moment, Brian Carter, the bistro's manager, appeared from behind the bar, a tall man in his mid-40s with slicked-back brown hair, an expensive watch glinting under the warm lights, and an air of authority that he clearly relished. He stepped between Lauren and the twins, his expression calm but his tone deliberately patronizing. "Is there a problem here?" he asked smoothly, his voice projecting just enough to make nearby tables turn their heads. Kayla took a breath, trying to keep her composure. "We were told there was a 45-minute wait," she said clearly. "But we just saw you seat that family immediately. We're just asking for the same courtesy." Brian's smile tightened, though his tone remained polite enough to sound reasonable to anyone watching. "We like to maintain a certain atmosphere here at Skyway Bistro," he said carefully, pausing for effect. "And sometimes that means seating certain guests first." The implication was heavy, deliberate, and landed like a punch to the gut. Kayla's voice cracked slightly as she tried to respond. "What exactly does that mean?" she demanded, her voice trembling with both anger and disbelief. Brian glanced around the restaurant, aware of the growing audience, and lowered his voice just enough to force them to lean in. "Lower your tone," he said softly, his eyes sharp as glass. "You're disturbing my customers." Amara stepped forward, putting herself slightly in front of her sister, her voice steady though her chest was tight with restrained fury. "We're not disturbing anyone," she said evenly, her words clipped and controlled. "We just want a table like everyone else." Brian's smile disappeared completely, his tone snapping like a whip. "Then you can find another place to eat," he said coldly. Kayla inhaled sharply, her heart pounding, her fists clenching at her sides. But before she could speak, a quiet voice came from behind them. "I'm so sorry," whispered Carla Morales, a young Latina server in her 20s, holding a tray of glasses close to her chest as she walked by. Her voice was low, barely audible over the restaurant's chatter. "This isn't right," she said softly, pausing just long enough to slip 2 food vouchers discreetly into Amara's hand. "He does this all the time. Brian targets black customers. I'll back you up if you need me." Her eyes darted nervously toward the manager before she walked away quickly, pretending to check on another table. Amara looked down at the vouchers, her throat tightening, her gratitude silent but profound. Kayla, meanwhile, was trembling visibly, her voice rising again despite herself. "We're leaving," she said loudly enough for several nearby diners to hear. "But trust me, this isn't the end of this." Brian's jaw tightened, his face flushing slightly as whispers spread among the tables. Several customers stealing glances at the scene unfolding. Lauren shifted uncomfortably at the podium, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Amara took Kayla's arm gently, guiding her out of the bistro, her voice low but firm. "Not here," she whispered softly. "We'll handle this at the gate. Outside." Kayla's steps were quick and uneven, her anger radiating in every movement as she clutched the straps of her backpack tightly. "Amara," she said through gritted teeth, "this is the 3rd time today. First Ethan, then Monica, now this. How many times do we have to just stand there and take it?" Amara's voice was calm but resolute, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "We're not just standing there," she said softly. "We're collecting everything." Kayla stopped suddenly, turning to face her sister, confusion flashing in her eyes. "Collecting what?" Amara's lips pressed into a thin line as she pulled her phone slightly from her pocket, revealing the recording app running silently in the background. "Proof," she said quietly. "All of it." Kayla stared at her sister for a moment, the tension in her shoulders softening just slightly as understanding sank in. They continued walking in silence, the crowd around them bustling as though nothing had happened. Yet every step felt heavier, every breath thicker. Neither of them noticed Lauren at the hostess stand pulling out her phone and dialing quickly, her voice low and urgent. "Brian," she whispered into the receiver. "They're heading toward gate C-17. Should I let Daniel know?" "Inside the bistro." Brian glanced at the departing twins through the glass doors, his jaw tightening as he muttered, "Yeah. Tell him to handle it." Another quiet call went out. Another subtle warning sent ahead to the gate. Another trap waiting to spring. as the twins walked toward C-17, unaware of the network building against them. Kayla's grip on her phone tightened, her voice low but steady as she said to Amara, "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Amara and Kayla Harris reached Gate C-17 with their hearts pounding, hoping the nightmare was finally behind them. But the moment they saw the stern face of Daniel Pierce, the Apex Airlines gate agent, they sensed this was about to get worse. The terminal was buzzing with activity, business travelers scrolling through emails, families wrangling toddlers, and the sound of boarding announcements echoing overhead. But for the twins, everything narrowed to this single moment. Amara handed over the economy passes Ethan had forced on them, her expression calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Daniel, a tall white man in his late 30s with close-cropped hair and an impatient demeanor, scanned the passes, his eyes darting up to their faces, lingering for a beat too long before he frowned. "Step aside," he said sharply, motioning toward the corner of the gate area. Kayla immediately pushed back, her voice tight and controlled but edged with frustration. "Why? What's the problem now?" Daniel didn't answer right away, glancing over his shoulder as two other passengers walked up. "I'll deal with you in a moment," he said curtly, waving the others through without hesitation. Kayla crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "You're letting them through. Why are we being singled out?" Daniel sighed dramatically, as though her question was an inconvenience, and held up the passes between two fingers. "These tickets were flagged," he said flatly. "I need to verify your identity." Amara opened her wallet, handing over their student IDs calmly. "Here," she said softly, "and if you check the system, you'll see our booking is valid." Daniel barely glanced at the IDs before narrowing his eyes. "These could be fake," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for them to hear. Kayla's patience cracked. "Fake?" she repeated, her voice rising just enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby passengers. "We've already been checked 3 times today. We've been searched, humiliated, and downgraded without reason. And now you're accusing us of fraud?" Daniel's voice hardened, his tone clipped and rehearsed. "Ma'am, lower your voice or I'll have security escort you out," he warned coldly. Amara stepped in front of her sister, her voice steady and low but firm. "Sir, we've complied with every request made of us today," she said evenly. "We've shown our IDs. We've passed security. If there's an issue, explain it clearly." Daniel didn't respond directly. Instead, he turned to the phone on his counter, pressing a button that sent his voice echoing through the terminal's speaker. "Security to Gate C-17. Kayla's mouth fell open, disbelief flashing across her face. "Are you serious?" she said, her voice shaking. "You're calling security on us. For what?" Before Daniel could answer, Vanessa Coleman, the gate supervisor, approached, a black woman in her mid-40s. Vanessa wore a perfectly tailored Navy uniform and carried herself with quiet authority. For a brief moment, hope flickered in Amara's chest. But it disappeared the second Vanessa leaned in close and whispered so softly only the twins could hear. "Keep your heads down and don't make a scene. Trust me, it doesn't help people like us." Her words cut deep, the sting sharper than Daniel's hostility. Kayla's eyes widened, betrayal flashing across her face. "You're really telling us to stay quiet while this happens?" she whispered fiercely, her voice trembling with anger. Vanessa's lips tightened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she straightened her posture, turned to Daniel, and nodded. "Follow procedure," she said coolly, stepping back as though her hands were tied. The boarding announcements continued. First-class passengers strolling casually down the jet bridge while the twins stood frozen in place, humiliated under dozens of staring eyes. Moments later, Michael Hayes, the jet bridge agent, appeared, A man in his early 40s with sharp features and a smug half-smile. Michael scanned the twins up and down before speaking, his tone dripping with mock concern. Problem here? Daniel handed him the passes, muttering something under his breath. Michael glanced at the boarding list on his tablet, then looked directly at the twins. These two are on the list, he said flatly, his voice loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. Kayla frowned, confusion flashing in her eyes. List? She repeated, her voice cracking. What list? Michael smirked, leaning closer so only they could hear. Security alert, he whispered, his breath deliberate, his words heavy. Flagged passengers. Could be a risk. Kayla staggered back slightly as though she'd been slapped, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Amara's heart pounded in her ears, but she forced her voice steady, meeting Michael's eyes without flinching. This is harassment, she said softly but firmly. And you know it. Michael's smirk deepened as he straightened his posture. Ma'am, he said loudly, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside until this is resolved. As the tension rose, two Apex security officers, Tom Ellis and Frank Gordon, arrived. Their black uniforms crisp, radios clipped to their belts, expressions neutral but distant. These the ones? Tom asked Daniel, his voice low and even. Daniel nodded. Yeah, they've been difficult. Kayla stepped forward, her phone in her hand now, her voice shaking but firm. I'm recording this, she said clearly. You're targeting us because of our race, and I want everyone here to see it. Tom immediately reached for her phone, his voice sharp. Recording is prohibited in restricted areas, he said quickly. Hand it over. Amara stepped between them instinctively, her voice cutting through the tension like steel. Don't touch her, she said firmly, her words measured but unyielding. The nearby passengers murmured softly, some raising their own phones, others whispering as the scene unfolded. Michael turned toward the crowd quickly, his voice raised as he said, Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're addressing a security issue. The announcement rippled through the terminal, but Amara noticed something different now. More phones were up, more people recording discreetly, sensing something wasn't right. Kayla, her voice trembling, looked at her sister. Amara, she whispered, we're not getting on this flight. Are we? Amara swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as she took her sister's hand and squeezed it tightly. Not yet, she whispered back, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Moments later, Michael turned back, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. Unfortunately, he said loudly, this flight is now overbooked. We've reassigned your seats. Kayla's eyes widened, disbelief turning into raw fury. You're lying, she snapped, her voice cracking under the weight of humiliation and anger. You're lying and you know it! Amara pulled her back gently, her voice low but unshaken. Kayla, she whispered softly. Not here. But Kayla shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. No, Amara, not again. Before she could speak another word, Tom stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his belt. Ladies, he said calmly but firmly, you need to come with us. A hush fell over the gate area as the twins stood frozen in place, every eye locked on them, every phone recording silently, every whispered judgment slicing through the air. Amara's chest tightened as she looked at her sister, the unspoken understanding passing between them like electricity. They had been pushed, humiliated, and stripped of dignity at every step, and now they were being escorted away from the flight their father had proudly booked for them. As they walked toward the terminal's edge, Kayla whispered through clenched teeth, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. We're calling Dad, she said softly. I don't care if he's in the middle of a board meeting. I don't care if he's in the middle of the sky. We're calling him. Amara nodded slowly, her voice barely audible, a promise threading every syllable. Yeah, she whispered. It's time. Behind them. Daniel lowered his voice and spoke quietly into his headset. Flagged passengers removed, proceeding with boarding. But what none of them realized yet was that the next phone call would change everything. The flight, the airport, and Apex Airlines itself. Kayla's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, her voice low but urgent as she whispered, I can't do this anymore. Amara, I'm calling Dad. And before her sister could stop her, she pressed the call button, the ringtone buzzing in her ears as the chaos of Gate C-17 roared behind them. And on the third ring, Derek Harris answered with a calmness that masked the storm brewing inside him, his deep voice steady but tight. Kayla? Amara? Why aren't you on the plane yet? For a moment. Kayla couldn't speak, her throat locking up. So Amara took the phone gently, her voice low and even but cracking slightly under the weight of everything. Dad, they won't let us board, she whispered, glancing back at the gate where passengers streamed past them onto the jet bridge. First they downgraded us, then TSA pulled us aside, then Skyway Bistro refused us a table. Now they're saying we're flagged as a security risk. There was silence on the other end for 3 long seconds, and then a sharp sound like a pen snapping echoed faintly through the phone. Derek's voice dropped lower, firmer, carrying a weight neither of his daughters had ever heard before. Who did this? Kayla took the phone back, her words spilling out, her voice shaking with anger and humiliation. Dad, it's everyone, she said, tears finally breaking through. The check-in guy, TSA, the restaurant, the gate agent, security. Everyone treated us like we didn't belong here, like we were criminals. Derek's breathing slowed, each inhale controlled, deliberate. But beneath it was the kind of rage that didn't shout. It calculated. Listen to me, he said quietly, his tone steady, each word clipped and sharp. You're not going anywhere. Stay exactly where you are. Do not move. Do not speak to anyone else. Do you hear me? Amara nodded instinctively, even though he couldn't see her. Yes, Dad, she whispered. Good, Derek said, his voice steel now. It ends today. Before they could respond. Derek hung up, and within seconds, the quiet hum of Apex Airlines' corporate command center in Dallas shattered as his executive override credentials lit up the control network, sending alerts through every terminal, every operations board, every cockpit in the air. Activate Omega Protocol, Derek ordered into his headset, his tone calm but ice-cold as the stunned operations director, Calvin Brooks, froze mid-step. Sir? Calvin stammered, adjusting his glasses. Omega grounds the entire fleet. 350 flights. Now! Derek interrupted sharply, his voice like a blade. And reroute all calls to my line. I want every executive on standby, within minutes. Chaos erupted across Chicago O'Hare and airports nationwide as departure boards began flashing the same red message over and over again. Flight delayed, return to gate. A ripple of confusion spread through the terminal, murmurs rising to shouts as stranded passengers began flooding airline counters, demanding answers. Back at gate C-17, Daniel Pierce's headset buzzed violently, a voice barking over the line, "Cease boarding immediately! CEO override!" Daniel froze, glancing instinctively toward Michael Hayes, whose smirk faltered for the first time that morning. Vanessa Coleman, standing nearby, looked between them, her brow furrowed as whispers grew louder around the gate. Kayla gripped Amara's arm tightly, her voice a shaky whisper. What's happening? Amara's phone buzzed again. Derek, FaceTiming this time. When she answered, his face filled the screen, sharp against the glow of his office monitors, his expression calm but lethal. Put me on speaker, he ordered, and Amara obeyed. Mr. Pierce, Derek said evenly, his tone low and deliberate. "This is Derek Harris. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Airlines. Effective immediately. You are relieved of duty." Daniel blinked rapidly, his jaw slack. "Wait. What?" Derek didn't pause. "You humiliated my daughters, denied them the seats they paid for, and called security on them. Hand your badge to Vanessa Coleman now." All color drained from Daniel's face as he slowly turned to Vanessa, who hesitated, glancing nervously between them before taking his badge silently. Derek's voice cut back in before anyone could breathe. "Mr. Hayes," he continued, his tone even colder. "Your actions on the jet bridge violated federal passenger rights and company policy. Security footage already confirms it. You're done." Michael tried to interject, his voice sputtering. "Sir, But Derek spoke over him, his voice rising slightly now, the steel uncoiling. "Not another word. Hand over your tablet and step away from the gate." Gasps rippled through nearby passengers as Michael reluctantly complied, his trademark smugness finally gone. But Derek wasn't finished. "Vanessa," he said, softening his tone slightly, "I need you to secure my daughters. Do not let anyone near them. I'll handle the rest." Vanessa swallowed hard, guilt flashing briefly across her face, and nodded slowly. "Yes, sir," she said quietly, moving to stand protectively beside the twins. "What's going on?" "Mr. Harris?" whispered Carla Morales, the young bistro server who had hurried up to the gate after hearing whispers of the confrontation. Derek's tone shifted, calmer now but edged with resolve. "What's going on?" he said softly. "Is change?" Then, switching back to his headset, he addressed his executives on the emergency line. "Listen carefully," he commanded. "Effective immediately. All 350 Apex flights are grounded. Stranding 48,000 passengers is the price of accountability. And if anyone disagrees, resign now. In Dallas." Murmurs of panic rippled across the boardroom as senior vice presidents exchanged wide-eyed glances. Stephanie Vaughn, Apex's polished VP of Operations and a longtime ally of board member Richard Langley, leaned forward, her voice sharp through the speaker. "Derek, this is reckless. You're triggering a corporate crisis." "No," Derek interrupted coolly, his voice like stone. "The crisis began the moment this company tolerated bias and humiliation under its roof. I'm not cleaning up a mess, I'm tearing out the rot." Back at O'Hare, the ripple of disruption turned into a tidal wave. Passengers from multiple gates swarmed Apex counters, demanding answers, their frustration captured live on social media as hashtags like #ApexDiscrimination and #GroundedForJustice began trending nationwide within minutes. Kayla glanced around nervously at the growing chaos, then turned back to her sister, whispering tightly. "Amara, we just shut down the entire airline." Amara nodded slowly, gripping her sister's hand, her voice soft but steady. "No," she whispered, meeting Kayla's wide, anxious eyes. Dad did. As the cameras rolled and live streams multiplied, Derek's voice returned over the speaker, calm and commanding. "My daughters will not move until I arrive," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Every decision made at this gate today will be documented, reviewed, and corrected. This company belongs to every passenger, not a privileged few." Vanessa lowered her head slightly, whispering to the twins without meeting their eyes. "I'm sorry. For everything." Kayla stared at her silently for a moment, the fury still burning behind her damp lashes, but she said nothing, only turning back toward the terminal where crowds now pressed closer, cameras flashing, questions flying. Derek's car was already on its way to O'Hare, escorted by security, but back in Dallas. Richard Langley sat in his corner office, swirling a glass of scotch, watching the news break across every major network. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his face as he dialed Stephanie Vaughn directly. He's just grounded his entire fleet, Langley said quietly, his voice smooth and calculated. It's time to move. If Harris thinks he can burn this company down and survive, he has no idea who he's up against. In Dallas. The Apex Airlines corporate headquarters was a battlefield in disguise, the sleek glass walls hiding a storm brewing beneath the surface as Richard Langley, a powerful board member and billionaire investor, leaned back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of scotch while watching live footage of chaos erupting at O'Hare International Airport, his lips curling into a slow, calculated smile as he muttered softly to himself, "Perfect. He just handed me the knife." Across the screen, news anchors spoke rapidly about Derek Harris's unprecedented decision to ground all 350 Apex flights, stranding 48,000 passengers nationwide, while hashtags like #ApexDiscrimination and #GroundedForJustice dominated social media. Richard's phone buzzed, and without looking, he answered. "Stephanie," he said smoothly, recognizing the voice of Stephanie Vaughn, Apex's polished vice president of operations and his closest ally. "Are you watching?" On the other end, Stephanie's tone was sharp, tight with tension. "Everyone's watching," she said, pacing the executive conference room. The stock dropped 8% in the last 30 minutes. Investors are panicking. The press is circling, and Harris looks like he's tearing down the company brick by brick. Richard chuckled under his breath, calm where she was frantic. "Exactly as planned," he said quietly. "We push now, and by tomorrow, the board will have enough ammunition to strip him of power." Stephanie hesitated, lowering her voice. "You're assuming we can control the narrative?" "Richard, Harris has the public on his side, every passenger video, every live stream, every hashtag. It's all making him look like a hero." Richard's smirk deepened, his tone shifting lower, more deliberate. Not for long. He turned in his chair, glancing toward Calvin Brooks, Apex's IT director, visible through the glass office wall, hunched over 3 screens filled with security logs and internal emails. Richard's voice darkened. "We're going to bury him before he realizes the ground is shifting under his feet." Back at O'Hare, Derek Harris stood in the Apex Executive Operations Suite, flanked by his crisis team, his jaw set like granite as he barked orders into his headset. "I want every document related to passenger incidents at O'Hare, LAX, Atlanta, and Dallas on my desk in the next 30 minutes, he said firmly, pacing in front of a wall of glowing monitors. "Every discrimination complaint, every employee suspension, every lawsuit settlement we've hidden, pull it all." Across from him, Calvin's screen lit up with an incoming override request, Langley's credentials. Derek's sharp eyes caught it instantly. "Calvin," he said coldly, "deny that override." Calvin hesitated, torn between two masters, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as sweat beaded at his temples. Derek's voice hardened. "If Langley wants control of this system, he'll have to rip it from my hands. You work for Apex, not his ego." Calvin swallowed, nodded quickly, and executed the block. But less than a minute later, Langley called directly. "Calvin," Richard said smoothly, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Grant my access to the internal servers. That's an order from the board." Calvin hesitated, his voice cracking slightly as he responded. "Sir, the CEO has locked it down under Omega Protocol. I can't." Richard's silence stretched for a beat before his voice returned. Low and dangerous. "Then I suggest you decide which side of history you want to stand on." He hung up without waiting for a reply. In the middle of this quiet war, Amara and Kayla sat on 2 metal chairs near Gate C-17, their knees pulled close. Vanessa Coleman standing protectively nearby while chaos swirled through the terminal. Kayla scrolled through her phone, her face pale as she whispered, "Amara, look at this. #ApexDiscrimination is everywhere. 2 million views in 30 minutes. Amara leaned in, her voice low but steady. "Good," she murmured softly. "The more people know, the harder they'll try to bury it." Kayla shook her head slowly, still absorbing the magnitude of it all. "But what if they try anyway?" she whispered, glancing up at the crowds of frustrated passengers. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening around her phone. "Then we make sure they fail," she said firmly. Meanwhile, back in Dallas, Stephanie slipped into a restricted server room where two Apex IT engineers were working frantically. "Richard's orders," she said briskly, setting her badge on the table. "Purge every O'Hare incident report from the last 5 years. Delete everything from the internal compliance drives, and wipe the backups." One of the engineers hesitated, glancing nervously at Calvin, who had just entered the room. "Ma'am," the younger engineer stammered, "if we delete this, there's no undoing it. Harris will know." Calvin's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. "Nobody's deleting anything," he said, stepping forward, his hand slamming the laptop shut. Stephanie's polished smile faded instantly, her voice turning icy. "Be very careful." "Calvin," she warned softly, "Langley signs your paychecks, not Harris." Calvin's jaw tightened, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I don't care who signs them," he said evenly. "I won't be part of a cover-up." Derek entered moments later, his presence filling the room like a storm front. "Calvin," he said, his tone clipped. "Have you secured the backups?" Calvin nodded quickly, pulling out a small encrypted drive from his pocket. "I mirrored the evidence to an off-site cloud server before the purge command went through." He said quietly, "Everything's safe for now." Derek's hand clasped Calvin's shoulder, his voice low and deliberate. "Good man," he said firmly. "Protect that drive with your life." Back in his corner office, Richard Langley watched live feeds of Derek addressing the press outside the Apex headquarters, his jaw tightening as he poured another glass of scotch. "He thinks he's winning," he muttered darkly. Stephanie's voice came through his speakerphone, tense but controlled. "Richard, the investors are split. Half are panicking. The other half think Derek's becoming a civil rights hero. If we don't move fast, he'll consolidate support." Richard leaned forward, his voice lowering to a growl. "Then we move tonight. Leak internal memos to the press showing him as reckless, paint him as unstable, and if we can't control the narrative..." He paused, tapping his glass against the desk slowly, deliberately. "We take control of the boardroom instead." At that exact moment, Derek's phone buzzed with a warning from one of his legal aides. "Sir," she said urgently, "Langley's filing an emergency petition to remove you as CEO. They're calling it gross misconduct." Derek's voice was calm, but his knuckles whitened around the phone. "Then we fight," he said simply, "with facts, with evidence, with the truth." He turned to Calvin, his expression sharp. "We're going to expose every complaint, every settlement, every suppressed video, and we're going to make sure the public sees what this company allowed to happen." Calvin nodded firmly, already typing commands to launch a secure upload. Amara and Kayla's recordings, the live streams from other passengers, the Skyway Bistro vouchers Carla had given them, and the TSA footage Calvin recovered. All of it was now protected in a secure server accessible to Derek's legal team and, soon, the public. But Langley wasn't finished. Late that night, he placed a private call to Stephanie, his voice low, cold, and measured. "If we can't bury the evidence, we bury him," he said simply. Stephanie hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Richard, what exactly are you planning?" He didn't answer immediately, only swirling his glass slowly before replying. "We're going to ruin Derek Harris before sunrise." The war between CEO and board had officially turned into all-out corporate combat, with digital sabotage, media manipulation, and power plays converging at once. But what none of them knew yet was that a single unexpected leak, an encrypted file Calvin had quietly stored off-site, was about to explode online and turn the entire company upside down. The following morning, the Apex Airlines boardroom was thick with tension, the floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking downtown Dallas as cameras from every major news outlet crowded outside, their lenses hungry for a story that had already gripped the nation. Derek Harris sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his tailored navy suit sharp but unpretentious, his expression calm yet unyielding as murmurs rippled among the board members seated around him. At the far end, Richard Langley leaned back in his chair, his posture confident, his fingers drumming lightly against a crystal tumbler of water, while Stephanie Vaughn sat poised beside him, her polished facade masking barely contained anxiety. The room fell silent as Apex's general counsel, Laura Simmons, closed the heavy double doors and spoke softly. "This emergency session is officially in order," before anyone else could speak. Langley leaned forward, his voice smooth, practiced, and dripping with false authority. "Colleagues," he began, his smile tight. "Our CEO's impulsive decision yesterday has stranded nearly 50,000 passengers, triggered a 10% stock drop overnight, and invited federal scrutiny for the stability of this company. I move to remove Derek Harris as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately." A few heads nodded, whispers spreading. But Derek didn't flinch. Instead, he pressed a button on the small remote in his hand, and the room's lights dimmed as a massive display screen behind him flickered to life. "Before we entertain motions," Derek said evenly, his voice steady but commanding, "you're going to see exactly why Apex Airlines is in this mess, and who's truly responsible." The first video began to play, grainy but clear enough to show Ethan Marshall, the check-in agent, smirking as he downgraded Amara and Kayla's first-class seats without explanation. Gasps erupted around the table as Ethan's voice rang out over the speakers. "First class isn't for everyone." The next clip showed Monica Reed, the TSA agent, mocking the twins during their invasive search. "People like you always try to get away with something." Then came the footage from Skyway Bistro, showing Brian Carter refusing them a table despite multiple empty seats. While a white family walked in and was seated immediately, a few board members shifted uncomfortably, others frowned deeply, but Derek let the silence stretch as clip after clip unfolded, every frame a damning indictment of systemic bias and neglect across multiple levels of Apex's operations. Finally, Derek's voice cut through the darkened room, low but resonant. "This isn't about one incident. This is about a culture that Apex allowed to rot under our watch while we looked the other way. And some of you," he turned his gaze directly on Langley, "went to great lengths to hide it." Langley laughed softly, though his jaw twitched. "This is a distraction," he said smoothly, his tone controlled but his knuckles whitening against the table. "You're weaponizing isolated incidents to justify reckless overreach. The board won't be manipulated by theatrics." Derek's lips curved into the faintest smile, his tone quiet but lethal. "Isolated?" He pressed another button, and an internal report flashed on the screen, a confidential document bearing Langley's signature. It showed over 1,200 passenger discrimination complaints buried over 5 years, along with emails instructing compliance officers to close cases quietly to avoid federal audits. Stephanie Vaughn's face drained of color instantly, her hand tightening on her pen until it snapped in half. Langley's mask cracked as Derek continued, his voice rising slightly now, the quiet steel giving way to fire. "You silenced victims. You suppressed lawsuits. And yesterday, when my daughters were targeted, you tried to erase the evidence again." Calvin Brooks, the IT director, stepped forward then, placing a small encrypted drive on the table, his voice steady but resolute. "This," he said, looking directly at Langley, Is every file you ordered me to delete. I saved everything. Incident logs, security footage, internal memos, settlement agreements. If you want to talk about reckless. Richard, let's talk about your cover-ups. Langley shot up from his chair, his composure shattered. You had no authorization to. Derek cut him off sharply, his voice like a hammer striking steel. Authorization? You lost that the moment you weaponized this company against the very customers who keep it alive. At that moment, Derek nodded to Laura Simmons, who tapped a tablet and activated the secure upload Calvin had prepared overnight. Within seconds, thousands of documents, passenger testimonies, and video clips were released publicly to a dedicated site, apextransparency.com, while Derek's prepared statement went live across every major network and social platform. This is not just about my family, Derek's voice declared in the broadcast, steady and unshaken. This is about every passenger who was judged, humiliated, and silenced under our roof. Today, Apex Airlines commits to full accountability, independent oversight, and rebuilding trust, not with words, but with action. Outside the boardroom, chaos erupted as the leak spread like wildfire. News anchors interrupted broadcasts, reporters crowded the Dallas headquarters, and within minutes, hashtag Apex Discrimination surged past 20 million views, joined by hashtag Grounded for Justice and hashtag Accountability First. Families who had experienced similar treatment began sharing their own stories, amplifying the movement until Apex became the center of a nationwide reckoning on racial bias in air travel. Inside the room, Langley's allies began to turn on him one by one, voices rising as they demanded answers he couldn't give. Stephanie Vaughn finally spoke, her voice trembling as she turned toward Derek. I followed his orders, she admitted softly, glancing at Langley briefly before lowering her gaze. I thought I was protecting the company. I was wrong. Derek regarded her evenly, his tone measured but resolute. You want to make it right? He asked quietly. Help us rebuild it. She nodded silently, setting her broken pen down as if laying her guilt on the table with it. After 3 tense hours, the board voted unanimously to remove Richard Langley, effective immediately. Security escorted him out as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, his once imposing figure now small against the backdrop of his public downfall. Derek didn't celebrate. He simply sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly as if releasing years of weight from his chest. He turned toward Calvin and Vanessa, his voice quieter now but filled with conviction. This isn't the end, he said softly. This is the beginning. 6 months later, Apex Airlines unveiled sweeping reforms under Derek's leadership, now dubbed the Horizon Initiative. Every employee, from executives to gate agents, completed mandatory anti-bias training. An independent passenger advocacy board was created, and a public dashboard tracked all customer complaints in real time. Vanessa Coleman, once complicit out of fear, became chair of the Accountability Council, dedicating her role to ensuring what happened at Gate C-17 would never happen again. Carla Morales, the young bistro server who had risked her job to help the twins, received a promotion and a company award for integrity. Calvin Brooks was appointed Chief Technology Officer, overseeing a new transparency platform praised nationwide. On a quiet June morning, Amara and Kayla returned to Gate C-17 for their rescheduled trip to Seattle. This time, Priya Patel, a newly hired Apex gate agent, greeted them with a warm smile, her tone respectful and kind as she said softly, "Welcome back, Miss Harris. Miss Harris, your seats are ready in first class." The twins exchanged a glance, their hands tightening briefly around each other's as they stepped forward. Kayla whispered to Amara, her voice trembling but steady with pride. "This is what change looks like?" Amara nodded, her gaze sweeping across the terminal where smiling faces, diverse staff, and respectful greetings replaced the stares and whispers of that terrible day. As they boarded, Amara looked back one last time, her eyes locking briefly on the new Apex banner above the gate. Dignity for every passenger, up in Dallas. Derek stood at the podium during a press conference, his voice steady but emotional as he addressed the nation. "This journey began with injustice," he said softly, glancing toward his daughters seated in the front row. "But it ends with accountability, with action, and with hope. Apex Airlines will not just be better, we will set the standard." Cameras flashed, applause echoed, and for the first time in months, Derek allowed himself a quiet smile. The fight had been brutal, the cost immense, but standing there, with his daughters' heads held high and a company reborn behind him, he knew it had all been worth it. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear stories like this.